Hi, I'm Nancy with Red Leaf DigiScrapping. Thanks for joining me. Many of my Page in a Pinch digital scrapbook page templates include stitch lines, but you may not have pre-made stitching that matches the shape on the template. This video tutorial will show you how to turn the stitch lines into realistic looking stitching in whatever color you need to match your page. So my page is almost finished, but I still have the stitching left to do over on the side here, and I'm just going to zoom in so that we can see that a little bit more clearly. So you can see the stitching that's here is still the stitching that's included on the template, so it's just a gray outline. The first thing that I need to do is add the color to it. So over in my layers palette, I'm just going to find the stitching layer, which is right here. So I'll click on that to select it, and now I'm going to add a layer right above that. So I'm just going to click on the Create New Layer icon, and that will automatically create a layer above the one that I was sitting on, which was the stitching layer. Now I'm going to fill that layer with a color. So I'm going to come over to the color picker and click on that, and I'm going to choose a little bit lighter color than that gold color that was already selected, and click on OK. And now I'm going to click on the paint bucket tool, and I'm going to flood that entire layer with the color that I just chose, and I'm going to scroll back out here so you can see it. So now what I'm going to do is clip the color to the shape of the stitching. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard and move the cursor so that it's in between the solid colored layer and the stitching layer, and you'll see the cursor turn into those two little interconnected circles. I'll click once, and now you can see that the creamy color that I had selected has clipped right to the stitching shape that was on my template. I'm going to go back to the Move tool and click on that to select it. So next I'm going to combine the color layer with the stitching template layer just by selecting the color layer, holding down Shift, click on the stitching layer so that they're both selected, and then right click anywhere on those layers and select Merge Layers from the drop down list. And now you can see that I just have one layer that's the shape of the stitching and the color combined. So now what we're going to do, now that we have the color added, is add a little bit of dimension and texture to make it look a little bit more like actual stitches. So to do that, we're going to come up to the Effects palette, and first of all we're going to click on Bevels, and I'm going to select this simple inner bevel. So just double click on it to select it. And now you can see that there's a little bit more shading on the stitching now, but I need to fine-tune that just a little bit. So down here on the stitching layer you can see this FX, and that indicates that a style has been applied. I'm going to double click on that, and it pulls up a Style Settings dialog box. And now I can go in and just make some minor changes to this style to make it look the way that I want it to. So what I'm going to do is actually decrease the size of the bevel just by dragging the slider bar down, and you can see as I do that stitching layer seems to pop a little bit more. And once you're happy with the amount of dimension that your stitches have, you can click on OK. Next we're going to add some texture. So making sure that that stitching layer is still selected, I'm going to come up to Filter, Texture, and Texturizer, and that brings up the Texturizer dialog box. Now there's a few different options that you have to choose from on the right hand side here. There's a few different options that you can choose from here just by clicking the drop down arrow. I'm going to go with burlap, and the scaling I'm going to actually bring up quite a bit because what I want it to look like is some twisted threads. So I don't want a whole lot of texture, I want just a few texture lines on it. And then for the relief, as I slide it up, you can see what that does. It just basically determines how much that texture stands out, how much dimension it has. I'm going to slide this back down to 3 and click on OK. And now you can see that the stitching, in addition to having some dimension, also has just a little bit of texture to make it look as though it's actually threads that are wrapped around each other. Now the last step to making your stitching look realistic is adding those stitch holes. So first of all I'm going to come over to the color And generally when I'm adding stitch holes, I like to do almost a dark gray with maybe a little tinge of whatever the background color is. So in this case, we're going to be doing a dark gray with a little bit of kind of orangey brown in there. Next, we need to choose the paintbrush that we're going to be using. So I'm going to come over to the toolbar and choose the brush tool. And you can see up at the top here your options change, so you can select a different paintbrush, you can choose the size, etc. So we're going to use a brush that has a soft feathered edge, and I'm going to select the 17, click on the X to close that, and now I'm going to come zoom right in so that I can see in between two of the stitches very clearly. Now before I make any stitch holes, I'm actually going to add another layer over here in my layers palette underneath the stitch layer. So I'm going to select the layer that's underneath my stitches, click on New Layer, and I'm just going to take a moment to rename those layers because it's very easy to get confused when your layers aren't named according to what's sitting on them. So we've got stitching and stitch holes. So now I'm going to make sure that the stitch holes layer is selected, and I'm going to put the paintbrush right in the middle of the two stitches and click once, and then I'll zoom back out a little bit and see how that looks. Now actually I want to make my stitch hole a little bit bigger than that. So I'll zoom back in, I'm just going to edit, undo that. And now I can either change my brush size by selecting the down arrow beside size and moving the slider bar up and down, or I can use the square brackets on my keyboard. So the right bracket makes the brush bigger and the left bracket makes the brush smaller. So I'm going to bump it up to 20 points and try that again. And that's a little bit better. That's about the size that I want my stitch holes to be. So now I can just go along and add my stitch holes. Just put the brush in between each stitch and add one little hole. Zoom back out. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a very slight drop shadow to the stitching because it is sitting up off of the page. So if this was actual stitching on a page, it would actually be casting a little bit of a shadow. So I'm going to come back to my stitching layer, and I'll come up to the effects palette and click on drop shadows, and I'm going to select soft edge, double click that. Now you can see that a very large soft shadow came in, and I'm going to have to just make some adjustments there. So I'm going to double click on that style settings icon to bring up the style settings dialog box. And under drop shadow here you can see the size and the distance, and those are fairly large. They're 42 and 20 respectively. So I'm just going to move both of those down quite a bit, and you can see as I move the slider bar how the look of the shadow is changing. So the size is actually reducing basically the amount of feathering that's on the edge of the stitching, and then the distance affects how far away from the stitching that shadow is falling. So I do want it to be fairly close, and I want the size to be a little bit smaller as well. And then the last thing I'm going to do is just adjust the color. So in this case we're going to choose a very similar color to the color we chose for the stitch holes. So I'm going to click on the color selector, and I'm going to come out here and actually just grab a brown, and then I can just slide that around to get it just right. Click on OK and click on OK for style settings, and that finishes off your stitching. And I'll just scroll back out here so that you can get the full finished effect. For information on where you can purchase additional digital scrapbooking lessons, kits, and templates, visit www.redleafdigiscrapping.com. Thanks for joining me.